Thank you so much for accepting my presentation to participate, my abstract to participate in this conference. It's not my first conference in general, but in Israel it's the first one. You can see everything, okay. So to start with, I'll make a few notes about the sources. So the main hero of my presentation is Solomon Goldenman, and though he's archived 3 boxes of his documents at the National Library of Israel, contains more correspondence. In this presentation, in my paper, I focus more on his correspondence with Lev Bukovsky, his former student. There are only 89 letters in this collection, so it in a way provides a limited view. But at the same time, since this collection contains not only letters by Goldenman, but also the ones addressed to him, it's possible to trace conversations more precisely and also to follow on some information exchanges in more detail. So a few biographical remarks about the main protagonists. Solomon Goldenman was born in Soroka or Soroki in present-day Moldova in 1885. He completed his university degree in Kiev in 1913, where he eventually joined the Ukrainian Revolution in 1917 as a representative of the Jewish Coalition Party, of which he was a member since 1905. In 1920, Goldenman left Ukrainian People's Republic. He went to Vienna, and from 1921 to 1939, he lived in Czechoslovakia, dedicating his efforts to first establishing and then teaching at the so-called Ukrainian Husbandry Academy, and then later its successor, Ukrainian Technical Husbandry Institute, which provided part-time education. He was also at the same time active in the Zionist circles in Prague. In 1939, just before the start of the war, he and his wife left for Palestine, where he lived until his death in 1974. As for his student, Lev Bukovsky, he was 10 years younger. He was born in 1895 in the Kiev province, and he was active in the Ukrainian Revolution, but not in politics. He was already at that time a librarian, and he cared for libraries and bibliographies. And in 1921, he first immigrated to Poland and eventually to Czechoslovakia, where he continued his studies in economics at the Ukrainian Husbandry Academy, and where Goldenman was his professor, his teacher. Eventually, Bukovsky immigrated to the United States and became active in the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences. This was the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in exile. And this is from where he resumed his communication with Goldenman in 1950s. What also brought them together is not only this experience in Czechoslovakia, but also their family statuses, because they were both married without children, so this was also a kind of common biographical feature for them. So his historiography and Goldenman's place in it. Goldenman is often mentioned in works, he's almost always mentioned in works on Ukrainian Revolution, on the Ukrainian Jewish relation in 1917-1920. But he mostly always mentioned in passing, so quickly. It is also common for Ukrainian scholars to refer to his works because both of his key works, which you can see listed in the slide, were also published in Ukrainian. In fact, the first one listed, the Letters of a Jewish Social Democrat, it was first published in Ukrainian and then in Yiddish and German. Why Ukrainian scholars also often use his works, because he often defends a positive, favorable view of Ukrainian-Jewish relations. A key scholar of Ukrainian-Jewish relations in the period of revolution, Henry Abramson, also uses Goldenman's works, but I don't think, as far as I know, he did not use these letters. Bukovsky eventually wrote a biography of Goldenman. In 1976, a full version in Ukrainian, so 2 years after Goldenman's death. In 1980, it's shorter, abridged version, which is more popular. And in 1981, he published a compilation of these letters that I worked with, and only 10 copies of this compilation exists. This is just an example of how this compilation of letters looks like. So in most cases, when the letter was handwritten, Bukowski provides also the typed copy, which he typed, and he marks it also as a copy. But it's only part of the collection of letters. Later on, letters from later years are all typed both by Goldenman and by Bukowski. And it is worth mentioning that Bukowski was not a professional historian, but he was a grateful student who had a great attention for detail, and he really desperately wanted to record what he learned from Goldenman about the revolution and state building and situation with the Jewish population in Ukraine in 1917, 1920, and to keep it for future historians. He was sure that this would be used by future historians, and he was right, as we can see. And actually, when Goldenman died, Bukowski was the one who advised his wife, Miriam, to bring and donate the documents to the National Library of Israel and Jerusalem. Also, a couple of notes on the terminology. As you can see in the title of my presentation, I used the word rapprochement. And just to explain why I'm using this, so this is the term that Henry Abramson used extensively in his work on Ukrainian-Jewish relations, which is called The Prayer for the Government, Ukrainians and Jews in Revolutionary Times. And in using this term, Abramson follows John Clear, who in his Imperial Russia's Jewish Question introduced this difference between a merger, the process of merger, and process of rapprochement, where a merger would stand for, in a way, complete blending, assimilation, whereas rapprochement was more a way of coming closer, of coming into a closer interaction and contact with the surrounding Gentile society, yet not fully blending. So, of course, John Clear writes about this in the context of Russian Empire society and the ideas of masculine at this period. But Abramson took this term and used it specifically for Ukrainian Jewish relations, and this is how I also apply it in the same manner as Henry Abramson, just for a period later, the period after the revolution itself. Another important question is, of course, the question of the language. Goldenman corresponded with Bukowski in Ukrainian, and in fact, Goldenman's command of it was fluent and free. And interestingly, at the time of Goldenman's illness, when he was already not capable of writing letters, his wife Miriam took the task to write several notes to Bukowski, and she remarks that even though she understands Ukrainian and she can read it, she was not able to write in it. So she proposes to Bukowski to write either in German or in Russian. These are the languages that she could write in. And since the following letter is in German, we can deduce what his response was. There are also some letters between Goldenman and Arnold Margolin, who was also another important Jewish figure in the Ukrainian Revolution. And interestingly, they also exchanged letters in Ukrainian, though of course they could have corresponded in Yiddish, for example. And also in one of the letters, Goldenman expresses disappointment that the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences contacted him in Russian and not in Ukrainian, as he remarks, quote, apparently because I was a Jew. So he still wished to be addressed in Ukrainian, and he felt disappointed that there was an assumption that since he is Jewish, he would only write in Russian. A quick overview of the main topics of the letters. Of course, the major The most important thread running through Goldman-Bukovsky correspondence is the topic of Ukrainian-Jewish relations. And it's interesting to explore it from the point of view of how Goldman placed himself in this debate in his letters in comparison to the official publications. Through his letters, Goldman expresses concern for and interest in Ukrainian-Jewish relations and how they continue to be portrayed several decades after the revolution was already over. Another important topic is the discussion of common Ukrainian colleagues and acquaintances. In fact, in 1950-1955, in this period, Goldman was actively reconnecting with many of his former Ukrainian colleagues from Czechoslovakia and discussed participation in common publications. Here Bukovsky mentions that Arnold Margolin commented on Goldman's firmness of convictions, saying that while some other Jewish political figures denounced their participation in the Ukrainian revolution, for example, Moses Rafes, who was part of the Bund and later joined communists, he entirely renounced Ukrainian national movement. So Goldman seemed to stand firm on his convictions and the idea of Ukrainian-Jewish cooperation. Another important topic is the exchange of publications, or rather it is a description of Goldman describes which books and periodicals he received from his Ukrainian and Jewish correspondents. At the time of no internet and difficult access to information, he asked Bukovsky to send him publications which may be of interest to him, and he described what would interest him. He said, it's either an important event in Ukrainian life or if it has connection to Ukrainian-Jewish relations. And in one of his letters, he also thanked Bukovsky for sending the Ukrainian spelling dictionary. As Goldman's personal archive at the National Library in Jerusalem demonstrates, he kept many of paper clips and publication excerpts that Bukovsky shared with him in Ukrainian or Russian, so it's still there. Another important conversation thread in these letters is the participation in publications. This is a whole separate topic. I'll just mention it without going into details. And of course, we cannot skip the part of correspondence which refers to Goldman's biography. Again, I think it ties up to this conversation we had today about memoirs and autobiographies. Bukovsky was really set on writing a biography of Goldman, but Goldman himself, was somewhat reluctant. In the end, he agreed to write a short autobiography, but in Hebrew, and then he translated it into Ukrainian and sent it to Bukovsky. So it was not an easy process, and there is a big difference between the few pages that Goldman wrote about himself and the eventual large publication that Bukovsky compiled. The letters mention also some other personal details, like the question of religion. Goldman states that he was non-religious at all, which is somewhat obvious from him being a member of Poale Zion and leaning to the socialist side, even though he eventually stuck with the Zionism. And interestingly, he was actually interested, despite his non-religiosity, he was very interested in Bukovsky's transition into Protestantism, and he asked Bukovsky to share the story of it. Among other curious biographical notes, it is relevant to say that Goldman shares with Bukovsky that he was experiencing difficulties after his move to Israel, to the land of Israel, because he felt that his conditions of life, the conditions of life that they were used to in Czechoslovakia, in Europe, were very different. So this sense of adjustment, even in the 50s, he still felt like he had difficulties getting used to it. And finally, just to mention, one of the topics of the letters is the current political events, like the wars of 1956 and 1967, which are the years when Goldenman contacted also Bukowski, and where he expresses sometimes the sense of doom, but at the same time of feeling that the new Israeli society will fight in any case, whatever the danger is. Now I would like to discuss some methodological considerations of working with letters, and some of these points already mentioned, like the epistolarium idea. So first of all, the first question, of course, is how reliable can private correspondence be as a source of historical research? There are many potential problems, such as what really happened and what the author's experience of this may not and is often not the same. So letters are a more personal and unreserved form than memoirs, though the author could still be restricted in what he writes by understanding that anyone can eventually read these letters. Letters can be intercepted and read by a wrong person. Also, related to the question of reliability is that the opinions and views can change over time. For example, in the case of Goldenman's letters, at a certain point he was writing to Bukowski saying that due to his political position supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians, he was put at a disadvantage in the newly established state of Israel, and that his vocal support for Ukrainians did not align well with political tendencies there. However, when in a later letter Bukowski asks for more details about it, Goldenman denies that he ever expressed such sentiments. Another important consideration is that, of course, we know that the letters are sources of information, but not so much about the facts as about authors' voices and experiences, motivations, the so-called sense of self. And they help historians to compare the tone and voice in what was officially published and what appeared in a letter. The idea of so-called epistolarium, the whole corpus of correspondence marked by the authorship of a particular person. I'm not sure that in the case of Goldenman I can use it because, for example, much of his earlier correspondence was lost alongside his library and valuable manuscripts that he was working on when he had to emigrate from Czechoslovakia to Palestine in 1939. As he reports to Bukowski, all he was working on was lost in the transport intercepted by the Nazis. So, but there is another aspect of this epistolarium which I think is relevant for me, is that the foundational considerations for working with letters is that there should be a certain level of base requirements. So these letters should not be sporadic or random. They should be written over a certain period of time, for example, several months or even years, and they should be written and addressed to someone significant. And I think that in the case of Goldenman-Bukowski correspondence, this is really true because their correspondence continued, though with breaks, from the 50s to the 1974 when Goldenman died. Finally, scholars suggesting asking, would letters be a dialogue or a performance? And here I find the author's definition of letters being a performance of a self useful, though I think this is more relevant for a researcher who gets letters written by one person and not so many letters written in response. Whereas in my case, it can truly be considered a dialogue because we can see Goldenman-Bukowski correspondence and replies to each other and to particular points, and in general, a continuing thread of communication. This dialogue is also representative of the dialogue between Jews and Ukrainians. To sum up, these letters, in addition to many other things that these letters do, they give us context for how later publications on Ukrainian-Jewish relations came to be. So as I have already mentioned, the first significant publication by Goldenman on Ukrainian-Jewish relations in the revolution, the Letters of a Jewish Social Democrat about Ukraine. It was published in 1921, and Goldenman himself calls in his later letters, he calls this publication a bomb, informational bomb. But the next key publication comes much later, so in the 60s. And thanks to these letters, we can see how this unraveled, how the publication happened, because initially the plan was to publish it in 1960. However, there were many hurdles and difficulties and delays, and Goldenman was writing to Bykovsky at a point when he was already quite hesitant that this would ever happen. So in the meantime, he published a shorter version of the Jewish national autonomy in Ukraine in the collection of essays in Yiddish, Yidden in Ukraine, in 1961. This was published in New York. But eventually it came to be in 1963 with a more widespread, famous version 1967, and with the English translation in 1968. So again, thanks to letters, we can reconstruct the story of this publication. Also, letters between Goldenman and Bykovsky provide a view on interpersonal relations and help us reconstruct how Bykovsky's biography of Goldenman came about, and to see whether it was faithful to what he wrote in his letters. With these letters, we know that Goldenman did not lose interest in the topic of Ukrainian-Jewish relations, and the resumed correspondence with his former Ukrainian colleagues helped him sustain this interest in these debates and helped him to continue contributing to these debates. So this connection between Goldenman and Bykovsky was clearly personal. There are also larger implications, and their correspondence is the testament to early Ukrainian Jewish cooperation and rapprochement. And just at the end, I would like to show the quote from Goldenman, which Bykovsky uses at the beginning of his collection of letters. The following idea will reign over all my contributions, that under the past one should draw a distinct line and start a new era in the relations between the two peoples, oriented towards the future. Thank you.
You talk about the letters being either a performance or a dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Can they not be both? As in, like, because if you have both sides, in this case you do or don't, I'm not sure. But either way, you can be in a dialogue and still perform what you're saying. So I don't think that I would see that as necessarily mutually exclusive. And if you do think of it as a performance like that, to multiple people, then you probably gain more about the person, because you're performing to a series of people, so you can see how they perform to different groups, to different individuals, rather than only seeing it through one lens. So yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more on that. And also, you mentioned at the end that the bulk of the correspondence is also personal, but that it's also, how do the letters merge this personal versus institutional, business, bureaucratic almost? Because you said the majority of the conversation were about the publications, about the news, about the news of the day, all these rather bureaucratic things as opposed to necessarily personal correspondence. So how do they kind of interweave between each other, or don't know?
Thank you for your questions. I'll start with the second one. Well, in case of correspondence between Goldenman and Bykovsky, it's more really personal, because There is more institutional correspondence of Goldenman about these publications in his personal archive, which is a separate set of documents. But with Bukowski, he at that point really did not have any institutional connection. He just, in most cases, expressed the state, he described the state of things to Bukowski. He said he would describe that I have been in contact with this and this and this people at different periodicals or publications, or for example, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. And this is what is happening. So in this case, Bukowski had no institutional weight or power to influence on this. He could only advise something, and he could write to somebody else at those organizations that Goldenman was in touch with and try to speed it up from his side. But I think these letters are exactly the example where it's mostly built on personal connections and discussions. So, yeah, maybe if I had some correspondence, well, then probably they did not write to each other. When they were in this professor-student relationship, then it would be different. Or if Bukowski wrote to him on behalf of on behalf of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in exile. But in this case, I think it's really more of the private, personal link. The second point. Yeah, I think it's a valid remark that it can be both considered a dialogue or a performance, depending on what you would like to ask the letters to do for research. It can be a performance if we think that Goldenman was fashioning himself in a certain way to Bukowski, but dialogue in the sense when we try to track particular events and particular threads, as I was trying to follow this discussion of the biography. They were going back and forth, and sometimes it's very minute details, like who pays for the express letter for this biography to be sent back, autobiography to be sent back from Bukowski to Goldenman once he's done with his. So eventually, when Goldenman sent his autobiography to Bukowski, he asked him to return it because he didn't have another.
We find quite a lot of cases that students become biographers. Maybe the most famous case in Russian Jewish history in the early 20th century is by Yaakov Lifshitz. Yaakov Lifshitz was secretary, student of Tzadok Spector. He was also a self-made historian. He wrote a book called Batenen Zichron Yaakov and others. But he also wrote a biography on Spector just about a year and a half after his death. And you can find many cases like this, and maybe it would bring you a think of traditions of students becoming biographers. And it could help a lot to understand the writer of the biography, but also the chapter for the author.